She's a great friend of ours, and we're very honored and excited to have her back today. So without further hesitation, let me turn it over to Linda Lizakowski.
Okay, thanks so much, Declan. And this was totally unplanned. I don't know if Declan noticed in my slides, but before the end of this presentation, you'll probably know what my favorite movie is because there's a slide representing that movie in our slide presentation. So I thought it was kind of a strange coincidence that Declan asked people to list their favorite movie. So maybe we'll get a chance to talk about that during the chat group. Well, hopefully we didn't scare anybody off with this title, Fundraise Like a Genius, and hopefully you're not sitting out there thinking, gosh, I'm not a genius, or am I going to be able to do fundraising? Because what the premise of the whole, this webinar is based on my latest book, Fundraising for the Genius, and the whole premise of this series of books is that we're all kind of geniuses in a way, and we base this on Thomas Edison's definition of genius, which is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. So what I want to do in this webinar is spend a little bit of time talking to you about the inspiration part, because you do need the inspiration. I think that's definitely needed in this field, and if you have a little bit of inspiration in you and are willing to put in the perspiration part of it, I think anybody can be successful and can fundraise like a genius. So let's talk a little bit about what the inspiration part is. And I think the first part of inspiration is kind of understanding the difference between philanthropy, development, and fundraising and how they all work together. So I'll spend a minute or two talking about that. Just to talk a little bit about the role of fundraising in a nonprofit, because sometimes we don't realize how important fundraising is for our organizations. I know one time I was at a board meeting and the chair of the board at this particular organization said, well, I don't understand why we need to do fundraising. We get all these government grants, and she didn't realize how important fundraising was for the organization, even though she was chair of the board. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Also, I think it's important who is involved in your fundraising. That, to me, is the inspiration part. It's getting everybody in your organization on board to understand fundraising and to be willing to get involved in it. And then I want to spend just a few minutes talking about ethical and legal issues in fundraising, because I think that's also part of the inspiration behind what motivates fundraisers. And then we'll get into the perspiration part and talk about what you can do to make your fundraising more successful. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the whole terminology of philanthropy, development, and fundraising. What's in a name? That's actually one of the titles of one of the early chapters of this book. And I think it is important that every organization have a strong philanthropic profile. Sometimes organizations really don't see the importance of fundraising, and the way I can always tell when I walk into an organization and am scheduled to meet with their development director, I can usually tell right away, or if they don't have a development director, maybe it's the executive director, but I can usually tell right away if this organization puts a high priority on philanthropy based on a couple things. One is I look at the organizational structure of the organization and I see where the fundraising person reports. And I've seen some charts where they have a vice president of finance and a vice president of program and maybe a vice president of administration, and then they have a development coordinator. Well, that shows me right away that development is not a high priority because their development officer doesn't have the title, the same title that all the other department heads have. Also, where the organization is located in the building even sends a message to me. I walked into one development director's office and she was sharing an office with 4 other staff people. And if an organization really has philanthropy as a priority, they're going to treat it that way. So one of the things that you can do, and on my website, and I'll be giving you my website information at the end of the webinar, I have something I call a philanthropic assessment. And I think this is a really great tool for you to use at a staff meeting or maybe a development committee meeting to talk about whether your organization really does see fundraising, development, and philanthropy as priorities, or whether it's kind of looked at as a necessary evil and something nobody really wants to do, but they know they have to do, or in some cases they don't even know that they have to do fundraising because they might think they can raise all their money through a government grant or through one special event. So I think it's really important, and one of the things that I have found in my years of consulting, which has been over 20 years now, and I have spoken to more than 24,000 professionals all over the world, and one of the common things I find is that a lot of organizations just don't put enough emphasis on creating that philanthropic culture within the organization. So an organization that does have a strong philanthropic priority, I can tell because I'll walk in and the development office has a very prominent position within the organization. My first development job was in a university, and we moved our development office actually while I was there because we were building a new building, and it was going to be the first building that people came into on the campus. And in that building was the admissions office and the development office, which showed me that this university did put a strong emphasis on philanthropy because the two things they wanted people first to do is enroll to become students. So the admissions office had the prominent position, but philanthropy also was very prominent for the university because they needed to rely on fundraising, not just on tuition. That never usually makes it enough money for any university. So I think you can tell whether an organization has a high priority, but taking this assessment might help you look at your organization and see what is the priority for philanthropy, because that's oftentimes one of the first inspiration things that you have to do is create that environment within your organization that everybody understands fundraising, why it's important, and how they can get involved. Just to give you an idea of typically what fundraising means, and this is information that shows all the nonprofit income sources. And you can see that the majority of money for nonprofits comes from mission-earned income, which means, for example, with the university, tuition. That's their mission, is to educate students. So tuition is usually the big thing. Well, that also happens in private schools. If you're an arts group, admission to your performances or admission to your facility might be the #1 source of income for your organization. And for some organizations, fundraising has a much stronger priority because they don't have mission-earned income as much as a university or an arts group or some other groups might have. Government funding also is a pretty good chunk. But then you can see when it comes down to the fundraising, individual giving is very, very high. Foundation giving and corporate giving a little bit less. And other could be things like for-profit enterprises that your organization might be involved with, or interest income on your endowment fund, or a number of other sources that might be available to you. But you can see that without that fundraising portion, which for many organizations, the government funding comes out of their development office because that's who writes the government grants. And you can see that that's the biggest chunk of the pie really comes for most organizations in fundraising. If you put that all together, the government, individuals, foundations, corporations, that's probably about half of the money that most organizations take in. So fundraising does play a key role for most organizations. So who does fundraising in your organization? This is another area that I think a lot of people struggle with, and they're not quite sure, you know, is it the staff, is it the board, is it the volunteers? And in a strong organization, it's all three working as a team. Development is really a team effort. I talk to a lot of organizations that are thinking about hiring their very first development director, and maybe some of you on the phone are in that position. Out of the 400 plus people that are on this line, I'm sure there's some of you who don't have a development staff person yet. And many times I'll talk to boards or executive directors that say, okay, we're going to hire our very first development director, and boy, are we glad, we'll be so glad to have this person on board. And once they make that hire, there's sort of this collective sigh of relief, like, oh boy, so we're so glad we don't have to handle that fundraising stuff anymore. We now have a director of development, and they're going to do it all. They're going to perform miracles. And this, again, shows me that the organization really doesn't understand the whole concept of philanthropy and development and fundraising, because it really is important that it's a team effort. And my answer to organizations that have that collective sigh of relief that fundraising is off their plate is always to say to them, guess what, folks, you're going to be doing more fundraising now than you ever did before, because once you have a director of development to organize this, you're going to be more involved in it. You're going to have a plan. You're going to have the tools to go out and do fundraising. So it has to be a joint effort between development staff, the executive director, or whoever your chief executive officer is, the board members, and volunteers. And if you do look at fundraising as a joint effort, you're going to be a lot more successful than the organizations who just think they can hire a director of development, or sometimes they think that when they hire a consultant that the consultant's going to perform miracles and now they don't have to worry about it anymore. So it's going to be really important that you think about fundraising as a team effort. I do want to spend a few minutes to just briefly talk about ethics and legal issues. This certainly could be a whole topic in itself, but I think this is an important concept to think about before you get into the perspiration of fundraising and how to actually do it, to think about things like the donor bill of rights, some type of code of ethics or standards. If you're a member of a statewide organization like MANO or PANO, the Pennsylvania and the Maryland Association of Nonprofit Organizations, or many others throughout the country, they have standards for excellence programs in many of these organizations. And it's really important to have a code of ethics when it comes to fundraising, because there are so many ethical issues that can really get you into a lot of trouble, like using a donor's money in a way that they didn't intend for it to be used, or not reporting back to the donor whether you're planning to sell their name on a mailing list to some other organization. Things like that can really hijack your fundraising efforts and cause you to fail at them, because you'll develop a reputation in the community that you don't really care much about your donors, that you're only looking at the money side of this. And fundraising is really not about raising money. Fundraising is about building relationships with your donors. And once you build the relationship, the money will follow. So I think it's real important that you're aware of the donor bill of rights and some codes of ethics, that you have a code of ethics in your organization that you follow. There are also a lot of legal things that you need to be aware of, such as IRS regulations. The area that a lot of people get into trouble with are things like they're having an auction and somebody buys an auction item that's maybe worth $50 and maybe they bought it for $40, and they're told that it's a tax deduction, and it's not a tax deduction because they didn't pay more than the fair market value of the item. So some things like that. State registration, and I know we have people from all over the country here, but almost every state in the country requires, there's about 10 maybe that don't, but the majority of them require that you register with the state before you engage in fundraising operations. And also, if you're working with consultants, in many cases they have to be registered within your organizations. And then there are things like local regulations. Many communities, cities, and counties have regulations about gambling enterprises, such as selling tickets or raffle tickets or things like that. So you really need to be aware of all of those things. So there's a lot of kind of inspiration, genius things that you do need to be aware of before you get into fundraising. But I want to spend most of this time talking about the 99% of fundraising, which is in perspiration. So let's start thinking about some of those issues. And the 99% of perspiration part of this is talking about where you find the money, kind of getting started in fundraising, measuring and evaluating your fundraising, and what methods are the most effective, which are the most effective ways to raise money. Because as we all know, money doesn't grow on trees. It'd be nice if we all had one of these plants sitting on our desk and we could just pop off the money whenever we needed it. But for most of us, we really need to spend some effort on determining some of these things. So one of the things that I think is important for you to realize, and this is just a different version of that chart that I showed you originally that showed all the sources of money that come into an organization. This is just the philanthropy part of it, and this does not count government funding, because government funding technically, I guess you could call forced philanthropy. You know, they take our taxes and then they determine how we're going to donate them. But this is strictly philanthropic donations. And what I have found is that many organizations tend to focus on certain areas, and one of the areas that they focus a lot on is grant writing. Well, let's, just hire somebody to sit here and crank out grants all day long. Or let's really, plan a lot of special events, because that's an easy way to raise money. And what you'll find is when you look at this, the majority of funding, about 80 to 85% of all the funding in this country, in the United States, I'm not sure if we have some other folks on the line or not, but in the United States, about 80 to 85% of all the funding comes from individuals, either in the form of, mail solicitations, major gifts, planned gifts, bequests, all those kind of things that come from individuals. And only about 5% comes from corporations. And usually every year, this is a 2011 pie chart, but this pie chart has looked pretty much the same for the last 40 years since Giving USA has tracked these statistics, and the Urban Institute also does some tracking of statistics. And you can see that foundations will only give maybe between 12 and 14% of the money. So where the focus really should be is individuals. And what many people do is focus their energies on writing grants and running special events, which are sometimes very labor intensive. And we'll talk a little bit more about the results that you usually get from all these different methods of fundraising. But the first, I think, and this could be kind of inspiration and perspiration, I guess, is realizing that individuals are where most of the money comes from is the inspiration part of it. Raising the money from those individuals is going to be the perspiration part of it. So where we find money, the other thing that I think is important to realize is what is called the 95-5 rule in fundraising and what it means for fundraisers. And I've been around this field so long that when I started in fundraising, this was actually the 80-20 rule, which meant that 80% of the money that you raise in your organization from philanthropy typically came from about 20% of your donors. Over the years, and some of you may be familiar with Pareto's law of 80-20, that 80% of the output is generally derived from 20% of the people or the machines that are doing the work. But the 80-20 rule was in fundraising, and then it kind of morphed into being the 90-10 rule, because there was more emphasis put on major gifts, and people were starting to make mega gifts of millions and billions of dollars even. So that rule then became the 90-10 rule, and in the past couple of years, most researchers are saying it's more like a 95-5 rule now, that 5% of your donors are actually responsible for about 95% of the money that you bring into your organization. And this is why there's such an emphasis on major gifts and planned gifts now, and even in things like capital campaigns, because there's so much opportunity out there to raise a lot of money from a small amount of sources. That doesn't mean that you should ignore the 95% of your donors that are giving you 5% of the money, because many times those donors can be cultivated into becoming major donors. But what it means is that you should be spending 95% of your time focusing on the 5% of your donors who are responsible for 95% of your money, and trying to figure out ways to develop a better relationship with those 5%, and then maybe move on to the next 5%. Because if you're spending a lot of money raising money from the masses, you're really losing out on the major gifts and planned gifts that are out there available for you. So where do we get started with all this whole process to raise money and to fundraise like a genius? Well, I think it starts in building a strong infrastructure. You know, there's a lot of talk within the United States and our country now of we need to really, you know, improve our infrastructure, our bridges, our highways, our, you know, electrical systems, everything that goes on. And the same thing happens within a nonprofit organization. There are some basic infrastructure things that you really need to have in place before you can get very active in fundraising. And one of those things is staffing. Sometimes people put off hiring a development director because they say, well, gosh, you know, we can't afford to hire a staff person to raise money. And, well, if we hire somebody, how long is it going to take them before they're raising their salary? And my answer to organizations when they ask me that question is, well, let's say you're a human service agency. Would you ever hire a case manager and say, well, you have to bring in enough caseload to pay your salary? Or would you hire a chief financial officer and say, you have to cut the budget by $80,000 because that's what we're paying you? Most people don't hire any other staff members that way, but for some reason, when they hire development people, they tend to focus on, are they raising their salary? And building a development program takes time. Sometimes it does happen. I mean, I worked once in an organization where the first year I was there, I raised probably 8 times my salary, but it was a very extreme situation that brought that on. Most of the time, I tell people it'll take you 2, 3, maybe even longer years to build up the development program enough that it is really profitable. But you have to look at return on investment, and you have to think about development as an investment. So some of the things that you need to invest in is staff. This is not really a job that can be done part-time. I know many people say, well, gosh, we can only afford a part-time person, but what I find is usually a part-time person ends up working full-time hours anyway because there's just so much to do in development. So if at all possible, I would suggest that you really look at having at least one full-time development staff person and one assistant to handle some of the clerical work, because there's a lot of paperwork involved. And a fundraiser, to be successful, can't be sitting behind their desk operating the computer. They need to be out and about meeting those donors and building those relationships. The other thing that I think is really critical is a software system, and I know many of you on the phone are GiftWorks users, and so you've already solved that problem. But if you haven't yet, I'll tell you one thing. I've seen organizations try to manage their list on Excel spreadsheets, and it creates a total nightmare. Not only is it 10 times as much work for them, but it also can really damage your relationships with your donors. For example, I've worked with an organization that said, oh, well, we have all these Excel spreadsheets, and I was on their mailing list 3 times. So I would get 3 newsletters, and this is back in the old days when we still printed hard copies of our newsletters. And I finally stopped supporting this organization because I thought if they can't get their act together and send me 1 newsletter instead of 3 printed, and they were very expensive newsletters that they sent out every month, I just stopped giving to them. So you really need a software system that can coordinate all your development efforts, and it's so, so critical to have that system, because unless you have that, you're not going to be able to build relationships because you won't know your donor's history. You won't be able to track and evaluate your fundraising method. So you really need to invest in GiftWorks before you can really get serious about fundraising. The other thing that you need is policies and procedures. And sometimes people say, well, you know, why do we need things like gift acceptance policies? We take anything we can get. Well, I can tell you a lot of horror stories. I won't go into all of them now, but I could tell you a lot of horror stories about organizations that were offered gifts. Well, I'll give you one quick example. A client of mine was doing a capital campaign, and they needed to buy land, and I live near Las Vegas, and this happened to be when real estate in Las Vegas was going for like $1.5 million an acre. Now you can probably buy it for $1 an acre. Not quite, but the market has certainly come down. But they were offered a gift of land, and they thought this was really fantastic until they luckily did their due diligence and found that it was going to cost them $500,000 to remediate the soil. So you have to really have policies in place for things like gift acceptance, investment policies. If you do have an endowment, how are they invested? If you get a gift of stock, what do you do with that? Do you have somebody to manage a stock portfolio, or do you sell that stock immediately and turn it into cash so it can be invested in one of your programs? There's a million different policies that you need to have in place, not a million literally, but there's a lot of different things that you need to consider. And just day-to-day procedures, like who opens the checks when they come in, who signs the thank you letters, how quickly are thank you letters sent out. I'm a firm believer that with the technology available today, there's no reason why it should take you longer than 24 hours to generate the thank you letter for every gift that comes into your office. You need a development plan. Organizations that don't have a written plan get themselves into a lot of trouble when somebody comes up with this brilliant idea like, oh, we should be running a golf tournament because the hospital ran one and they raised $300,000. Well, maybe the hospital's been running that for 20 years, and maybe they have a lot of people who like to play golf, and they have board members who will support it. They have sponsors already lined up. So maybe the golf tournament isn't the right thing for your organization. But a lot of groups get kind of sucked into doing every good idea that sounds like a good idea at the time. But what they end up is just scattering themselves and trying to do too much with too little resources. So you really need to have a written development plan that outlines exactly what your long-term goals are, what your short-term goals are, and what you're going to accomplish in the next year. Who's going to do it? When is it going to get done? How much is it going to cost? How much is it going to raise if it's a fundraising activity? So you need to have some of these basic infrastructure things in place. You need a good case for support. Why should people support your organization? Sometimes when we work for nonprofits, we're so caught up in our mission, and we don't realize that nobody else in the community has a clue of what we actually do. And if you don't think that's true, just get out there sometime and ask some total strangers what they think your organization does, and you'll be amazed at the answers you get. So you need to develop a written case for support that talks about your organization, not from the perspective of your needs, but the perspective of how your organization fills a need in the community. So that's a real important part of your infrastructure that you need to have in place. And I could spend an hour talking about each of these topics, I think, but I'm going to move on because we only have an hour in total to get through this, and I do want to allow some questions and answers at the end. The other thing about getting started is understanding the role of your board and your staff and your volunteers, and I've talked a little bit about some of this, but the role of a board in fundraising is really critical. Most organizations that struggle with fundraising, it's because their board doesn't get involved. Their board hasn't accepted fundraising as one of their roles, or maybe they've accepted it, but they just don't know how to do it. So the first thing that you have to be cautious about is how you recruit board members. And I've seen a lot of board recruitment gone awry because maybe they have a job description, and in that job description they say they expect the board to give money, or they expect the board to raise money. Hopefully they have both in there. But sometimes when they're recruiting, they just want to fill a seat with a warm body, and it's like, well, I know the job description says that you have to help us raise money, but don't worry about that. And they somehow think once these people get on the board and are so impressed with the organization, then all of a sudden they're going to embrace fundraising. And you can't expect that to happen. It has to happen at the recruitment process. You have to be upfront with people and tell them that fundraising is one of their roles, and explain exactly what you expect from them. You probably also will need to provide some training and education for board members. I find many boards really don't realize the connections that they have until I come in there and do a board training session for them, and they find out that, oh gosh, yeah, I could ask so-and-so for money, and they never really thought about it before, or I could do this to help with fundraising. So a lot of times boards need some training and education. I also believe you really need to have a strong development committee, and this committee should not just be Oh yeah, we have 2 or 3 board members that said they'd work on fundraising. A development committee should have, depending on the size of your board, maybe 2 or 3, maybe 5 or 6 board members on it. But it also should have community members, because this is a great way to get other people involved in fundraising besides your board. And it's a fantastic way to have a sort of a training ground for board members, because once they've served on a committee, especially the development committee, where they have been active in fundraising, you know that if you invite them on the board, they're going to understand fundraising and be willing to embrace it. So I'm a strong believer that a strong development committee can do wonders to really improve the results of your board. And then there are other volunteer committees that you might have, a special event committee just to focus on a special event, or maybe a planned giving committee that focuses on developing planned gifts for your organization, a capital campaign committee, a major gift committee, a business appeal committee. There are loads of ways you can involve volunteers in your fundraising, and not just at special events and not just stuffing envelopes. There are a lot of other things that volunteers can do for you, and I have a whole chapter in my book devoted on the ways that you can involve volunteers. So I think that's an important part of the perspiration, is getting people involved. I want to move on and talk about what methods are the most effective in fundraising. And this is oftentimes a surprise to people, that direct mail acquisition, which means that you don't have a built-in list of people. If you're a college or university, sure, you have a list of alumni. You don't have to usually acquire names. If you're a hospital, you might have a list of grateful patients that are donors to you. But if you're the local homeless shelter, you probably don't have a built-in database of prospective donors. So you might need to go out and acquire names, which means you go to a list broker and you rent a list of names, either for a one-time use or for a certain time period. And typically you'll get about a 1 to 1.5 response rate. Now that doesn't sound very high, and it's not very high, but a lot of times people do direct acquisition as a way to build their database, because they don't really have enough people in their database to do effective mail or telephone or in-person solicitation. So it's a great way to build your database, even though you won't get a fantastic response. Direct mail renewal, where you're renewing people that are already donors, or they're members of your organization, or they somehow have an affiliation. You're not just sending out a cold letter to people who don't know you. There, your response ratio is much better. It's usually 15 to 20%. And telephone, even though a lot of people kind of dread the whole thought of telephone fundraising, it's actually much more successful than mail, because you'll get typically a 30 to 35% response rate. Now, this is assuming, of course, that you're calling people, again, who know your organization, who are already donors or members or use your services in some way. I would never, ever recommend doing telephone calls to a cold list, like picking up the phone book and just calling names. That never works, and you'll probably get a lot of people very angry with you. But obviously the most effective way to raise money is in person. So that will give you about a 60 to 65% response rate, which means that out of every 100 people you see, 60 to 65 of them are probably going to give you a gift. Maybe not necessarily the size of gift you asked for, but they will give a gift. Now, of course, if you look at these ratios, you'll probably think, well, why would we spend any time doing anything else except in-person solicitation? And the answer to that is pretty simple. It's usually time. Sometimes it's geography. Maybe you have a national audience and a national appeal. You obviously can't travel around to see every donor in person. So what I typically recommend is that you go back to that 95-5 rule and first run a list, go to your GiftWorks database and say, who are the top 5% of our donors? And you should look at the top 5% of current, maybe for this year, donors, but also look at the top 5% of lifetime donors, because sometimes your loyal donors can be just as persuasive as your major donor people. So I would say, you should be trying to see at least the top 5 to 10% of your donors in person at least once a year. And remember that it costs 6 times as much to find a new donor than it does to retain a current donor. So instead of spending all your effort thinking about, oh, where do we find new donors? We have to get out and find new donors. Focus on the donors you already have, because they're your best prospect to take it to the next level. So once you are ready to go to maybe you're already doing all these things. Maybe you're already doing mail, phone, individual giving. Some things that you might consider when you're ready to take your fundraising to the next level are monthly giving programs. Monthly donors are way, way, way more loyal. I forget if it's the exact percentage, but I think it might be they're 10 times more loyal than a person who gives once a year. So you really want to encourage ways for people to set up maybe automatic deductions that will go right into the account on a monthly basis. You might want to think about, if you haven't already been doing major gifts, how can you start a major gifts program where you're focusing on those top 5 to 10% of your donors and really trying to develop major gifts from that. Many, many times you'll be at a stage where you have to think about a capital campaign for building. Maybe you need to expand your programs and you really need a new facility. Or planned gifts is another thing that every organization should be doing, because every organization can take advantage of this huge transfer of wealth that is taking place from, the baby boomer generation was inheriting that money, but pretty soon the baby boomer generation will be the ones leaving that money either to their heirs or to nonprofits. And the very wealthy people oftentimes don't want to leave a lot of money to their children, because they figured that they've given their children a lot when they were growing up, and hopefully they've gotten them off to a good career path, and they want them to have the experience of earning their own money. So a lot of times very wealthy people are much more interested in giving money to charity and giving through planned giving vehicles. It's a great way to do that. You might also think about moves management, which is a whole process where you focus on building a donor relationship, and you take a donor one at a time and you say, what's the next move with this donor? Is it time to go visit them in person? Do we send them to a newsletter? Do we invite them to come and take a tour of our organization? Do we arrange for one of our program people to meet with them? And you really treat donors on a one-to-one basis. So a moves management program can be really, really important. And now we're going to get into the time where I think you'll be able to guess what my favorite movie is of all time. And it's Young Frankenstein. I just love this movie. It was an old, oh gosh, I think it's about 20 years old, if not more. But the reason I put this in here is I think being in the laboratory like Dr. Frankenstein was, it's measuring and evaluating your success is really important. And a lot of times we think, well, gosh, we can measure some of our own success. And yes, there are many things you can do to measure your own success, but sometimes you do need to see a doctor. And I think the words that were coming out of his mouth when this picture was taken is, it could work. It might work. That he might actually be able to bring his creation to life. So this is kind of my favorite movie, and I thought it was just a cute little thing to throw in there. But it is important to evaluate your development program for a lot of reasons. First of all, your funding sources are expecting more bang for the buck. Many of the proposals that you might be writing to foundations, they're getting much more serious about asking for reporting. They want to know how their money was used. They want to give to collaborative efforts oftentimes, where instead of giving to one organization, maybe they found 3 nonprofits that are willing to go together and work on a solution to a problem that's in their community by each providing different types of services. So funders are looking for more bang for the buck, and they want to know, what are the results of your programs, and are they really working? Boards, I think, have much greater expectations today, too. And sometimes boards and even CEOs feel that development is dispensable. One of the things that really saddened me during the recession is that nonprofit organizations are saying, well, we have to cut back, so we're laying off our development staff, which seemed to me like cutting off your nose to spite your face, because the development staff are the people who could help you raise the money, and instead they were getting rid of their development staff. So you really need to evaluate your development program so you can show success to your board members and your executive directors. And if you don't have a plan with goals, and if you don't have ways to measure those goals, it's going to be very, very difficult for you to justify the existence of your development program. So some things I think that can help you measure success, and this is kind of the other side of, I showed you different methods and what was the most effective as far as response rate. This is the other side of the coin, is what is the cost to do these different methods. And acquisition mailings, where you have to go out and rent a list and spend money on mailing, typically cost $1.25 to $1.50 for every dollar you raise. And you might think, well, why the heck would anybody do that? But as I said before, it's a way to bring new donors in. The thing is, you have to have a plan, and what are you going to do with those new donors? How are you going to build relationships and get them to renew their gift? Because direct mail renewal only is going to cost you about 20 to 25 cents for every dollar raised. Special events, which I think most organizations are way too dependent on, typically raise 50 cents, cost 50 cents for every dollar that's raised. So if you bring in 100,000, your expenses might be 50,000, and that's pretty typical. Now, if you're doing better than that, that's great. But one of the things that I think a lot of people don't realize is that besides the hard costs, you have to also look at soft costs like staff time. How much staff time does it take to do an event? How much volunteer time? Are you burning out your board members or your donors by constantly doing event after event after event? I recommend usually like 1 or 2 events at the most per year, because otherwise I think you burn yourself out too quickly. Foundation proposals typically cost about 20 cents for every dollar raised, because there is some investment in some of the research tools that you might be using. Maybe you have to go on visits or host site visits for the people from the foundation. And again, personal solicitations, if you remember, were the most effective in the response rate, are also the most cost effective, because typically a personal solicitation will only cost you 10 to 20 cents for every dollar raised. And if you're raising money in a finite community, in your city or your county or your little town, your costs are probably on the low end of this, maybe even lower than 10%, because you don't have a lot of travel expenses. But looking at those outcomes, I think it's really important for you to measure that on an ongoing basis. The other thing that I think is important, to look at your donor history. And if you have your donor software in place, you should be using this to track all of your development activities. And you really need to track what the responses are from internet responses, from telephone, from direct mail, and then compare your results with those national statistics that I just showed you. And if you're doing poorly in some area, then it's time to look at that area and say, what are we doing wrong? You know, maybe we need to bring somebody in here to help us develop a better method to do this. Analyzing your special events, and that's another tool that you can find on my website. I have a special tool that just helps you look at special events, not just from the dollar perspective, but from how much staff time and volunteer time they take. Are they events that will help you cultivate relationships with major donors, all those type of things. Grant proposals. How many have you written? How many have been funded? Did you call the donors who didn't fund you and find out why? Did you follow up with the donors who did fund you to make sure that the next time you go back to them, they're going to be willing to support you again? Your major gifts, you know, how many major gift calls does it take you to get a major gift response? As I mentioned, usually major gifts face-to-face should be giving you about a 65% response ratio. So if you're going out and calling on 10 people and you're getting one gift, then you're probably calling on the wrong people, or you're using the wrong approach when you do call on them. Yeah, do you have planned gifts? If you do, those are kind of hard to predict. We can't predict when someone's going to die and leave us a bequest, but you can predict how many approaches you've made to plan giving people, how many seminars you've conducted, and what are the results of that seminar. If 20 people attended, how many of them asked for more information and wanted to sit down and talk about a planned gift? Capital campaigns, I'm amazed at how few people go back and really take advantage of a capital campaign. I do a lot of campaigns, and when I talk to people, I say, well, do you have the results of your last capital campaign? Oh, yeah, they're in a box somewhere. They've never gone back to those volunteers. They've never gone back to those donors, and they've just taken a capital campaign gift and then forgotten about people. Volunteer results are critical to track in your donor software. If you have volunteers doing personal solicitation or telephone calls, you want to know which ones have been successful and which ones haven't. So there's a lot of hard data that you can get from your software if you're recording all this correctly. And in addition to the hard data, there's some anecdotal things too. You should be sitting down after every event and doing a postmortem and find out what went well and what didn't go well. You should analyze the data that's in your software system on at least a monthly basis. Look at things like, which mailings were the most successful, and if you code somehow the response envelopes you sent out, if you sent out 3 mailings a year and 2 of them bombed, but the year-end mailing was very successful, then maybe next year you only want to do a year-end mailing and forget the other 2. Having major gift calls, make sure that you fill out a contact report after every call so you can track and put that information into your software system. Debrief with your volunteers. Talk about these things at staff meetings, what's working and what isn't. Sometimes if we have a large development staff, it's really hard because maybe the director of development doesn't know what everybody else is doing. So these are some things to talk about at staff meetings and development committee meetings, and really analyze what you're doing and see what's working. And sometimes you just need to have an outside person come in and do a development audit for you, because that way you can get a real objective viewpoint of what's going well and what's not. So kind of to sum up here, I think putting it all together, in order to fundraise like a genius, you have to first of all take time for the inspiration part. And this is a tough position. It's not an easy job. So we really need to gain that inspiration. And my suggestion is to attend as many, obviously I'm speaking to the choir because you're already on a webinar, but sometimes the live in-person workshops and conferences can be really fantastic too, because you not only get to hear from an expert, but you get to share experiences of other people in the room. Read as many books as you can. If you're inclined to do so, write about, blog about your fundraising role, or if you have a special expertise, maybe you're a grant writer and you'd be interested in setting up a blog about grant writing or participating in other people's blogs, or get out and speak to a group if you have a special area of expertise. I think the way seasoned professionals keep themselves alive and motivated in this field is by mentoring others and speaking and writing for the profession. But also be prepared for the perspiration part, making sure that your board gets involved, that you recruit volunteers to help, and that you're spending your time on the things that really count, not the things that may be superfluous. And sometimes I find development people get pulled into all sorts of things in their organization that they really shouldn't be involved in. So spend your time on things that really are important and that are going to count, and make sure that you do have a method to measure and evaluate your success. I'm going to give you quickly my website, because all of the things that I've already mentioned and some that I maybe haven't mentioned, for instance, I have a case statement checklist, a tool called Are You Ready for a Capital Campaign? I have a Fundraiser's Private Vault, which is a paid subscription fee, And all those things you can find on the cvfundraising.com website, and the top 4 are all available free of charge, so you can download. And there's many other tools. I have a lot of evaluation tools that you can also access there. And I did want to, before we close, leave with a special offer. I mentioned that this webinar is based on my latest book, Fundraising for the Genius, and I can offer a 10% discount on that book to anyone who's interested in purchasing it. I think the sale price is $24.95, so you can get a discount from that. And if you email me, I'll send you the discount and the link to purchase that book. But I also would offer, when I do things like special offers for board training, development audits, and development plans, I always give GiftWorks users a special discount on those. So if you're interested in any of those things, you can just contact me. And I do have my information. I actually have 2 websites. The one is just in the process of being built. I have the cvfundraising.com, where all those tools I mentioned are. I have another one that's just in the process of being built, and that's lindalizakowski.com, which will have some other information. And I have my toll-free number on there. But usually email is the best way to reach me, because I know we have some time for questions and answers. But in the next 5 minutes, if we don't get to your question, feel free to email me directly, because I always want to make sure everybody gets their questions answered. So at this point in time, I'm going to turn it over to Declan and see what questions we might have waiting for us.
Absolutely. So feel free to type and submit into the question panel on the right, and we'll get to as many as we can. If you have to sign off, thank you for joining us today. We really do appreciate it. For upcoming webinars and everything GiftWorks, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and visit our blog, which is blog.giftworksconnect.com. Really quickly, we asked a question earlier in the webinar. It was your favorite movie of all time. Linda, yours was Young Frankenstein. Mine was The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Let's see what a few of you said. Let's see, Monty Python and the Holy Grail, Euro Trip, Goonies, which, wow, I can't believe I overlooked that one. That's a great one. An American in Paris, The Notebook, The Great Escape, The Patriot, Battle Royale, Twister, and let's not forget Gone with the Wind, which is a classic, just to name a few. So there you go. So here are a few questions for you, Linda. Can you share any tips as to how to get started with locating grant money? That's from Donald.
Okay, there's a couple of things to start with. There are some great research tools available through the foundationcenter.com or grantstation.com. You may be aware of those 2 areas, and that'll help you with the research. But another tool is once you've identified some foundations that you think might be available, if they're local foundations, and mostly I think local foundations are usually typically more supportive of their local communities, I would also sit down with your board and your development committee and ask who they know who might serve as a trustee for one of these foundations, because sometimes if you have an in with the foundation, it's going to be a lot easier to get in to see them and get them started. But those are some tips that I would share on doing the research. Yeah, and you may have a program that appeals nationally, so then there's a wealth of, I forget how many foundations there are in the country, but there's a lot, and the Foundation Center or the Grant Station directories are probably the best tools to help you with those.
This question is from Ellen. Is the board the best place to begin in order to develop a culture of philanthropy in your organization? What's the best way to convince your CEO first?
I think it's the CEO and the board together really have to come to this conclusion. If your CEO is supportive, I would go to them first and say, how do we get the board involved? Because sometimes development people don't get to interact with the board. That's another sign that you don't have a strong philanthropic culture, because the development person should be attending board meetings and even having some input into choosing board members. If your CEO is resistant, then if you have the opportunity to maybe talk to a board member, maybe the chair of your development committee, if you have one, they might be able to talk to the CEO. But I think a lot of it is just convincing people of the importance. And sometimes it takes an outside person, like bringing in the consultant to come and talk to them. A lot of times when I do development audits, the best thing that comes out of the development audit is that the CEOs and the boards really understand what needs to be done, because sometimes when you pay somebody to come 50 miles and carry a briefcase, it does make a difference. That's the old definition of a consultant, is somebody that gets off a plane and has carrying a briefcase. But if you can't afford a consultant, you might go to another nonprofit in your community who is successful and has a good understanding of fundraising. Maybe ask that CEO to talk to your CEO, or that board chair to talk to your board. So I think those are all ways that you can help convince the powers that be that fundraising does need to have a priority.
Right, Linda. This question is from Linda. What would you focus on if you have very, very limited staff and limited funds for development?
I think I would focus on, if you already have the infrastructure in place, then I would focus on identifying your top 5 to 10% of your donors and developing ways to build better relationships with them, while at the same time, maintaining your other methods of fundraising. And I would definitely, examine the number of events that you're doing. And if it's more than 2, I would probably suggest you need to re-examine those events and maybe think about consolidating or getting rid of some of them, because with a small staff, it's really hard to manage events and do everything else at the same time.
This question is from Shelley. What is the development director's role in a development committee? Who should chair the meeting, develop the agenda, etc.?
The chair of the committee, the volunteer, should definitely chair the meeting, but the development director and the chair together should really be developing the agenda, because there may be some things that the volunteers feel are important to discuss. The development director might have some other really top priority issues. So I would say definitely that volunteers should be chairing the meeting, just like your board chair chairs the board meeting, and the executive director usually gets involved in developing the agenda. So the same thing follows through with the development committee.
All right, we'll do 2 more questions, Linda. This one's from Lucas. What would you consider the top 3 things for a brand new organization to begin with in regards to fundraising?
Okay, if you're a brand new organization, I would say the first thing is make sure that your board, that you create a large enough board that they really understand fundraising and are willing to get involved, because if they aren't, you're not going to be successful. And then the second thing I would start with is building the infrastructure, making sure that you have the software, the policies and procedures, the case for support. And then the third thing would be to develop a written plan of action. That would be the first 3 things I would address. These are great questions, by the way.
Yeah, I wish we could get to all of them. If you can't, if we have time for one more, and obviously feel free to email Linda. But last one, this one's from Rose. It's very specific. How do we find the philanthropic assessment at Linda's website, at your website?
That's a good question. My website has so much stuff on it, but the best thing to do is just go to the cvfundraising.com website, and there's a search field there, and search for philanthropic profile, and that should bring it up. If you have trouble, let me know, and I'll be happy to email it to you. But if you search for philanthropic profile, it should bring it up.
Perfect. All right, well, as a reminder, you should expect to receive an email with a link to watch this webinar in its entirety. A huge thank you to Linda Lizakowski for taking the time to lead this webinar and equip nonprofits with this valuable information. We don't pay Linda, and she doesn't pay us. We count it a privilege and look forward to bringing these webinars to you, and hope that you find them engaging and, of course, helpful. We appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to be with us. From everyone here at GiftWorks and Linda, it means a lot to us, and we thank you. Be sure to register for our next webinar with Robin Blakely. She will present how to use Facebook to raise funds for your nonprofit, and that is Thursday, September 6th at 3 p.m. Eastern. And don't forget, by registering and attending, you could win a $50 gift certificate to giftsthatgive.com, where every $5 spent, $1 goes to charity. With that said, we wish you all the best in whatever mission lies before you, and we hope to see you at our next webinar. Have a great day.